There's been several articles written about how long it would take for the US to replace all the weapon systems, like Javelin, that it's given to Ukraine. Most figures put that around 5 years, which made me wonder about Russia replacing their losses. Oryx's list shows a lot of lost vehicles, and these make up a good percentage of Russia's pre-war inventory in operational service. When the war ends, they're going to have to replace these to build back up their military. So, how long will that take? How much will it cost? And can Russia even afford it? But first, real quick, this video is sponsored by Keeps. One scary phrase that stuck with me in my mind is the fact that 2 out of 3 guys will experience hair loss by the time they're 35, especially since I'm just a few years away from that. My father and his father lost hair, and I've always heard and kinda rest assured by people saying that hair loss typically is passed down from your mother's side, and her father had a full head of hair. But then, while making this video, I actually found out that was a myth. There's a lot more to it than that. And this is where Keeps can come in. Keeps offers clinically proven, research-backed treatment to stop hair loss and improve hair growth. And they make it real easy, with everything you need just a few clicks away. Doctors, different plans, a pharmacy, and you never have to leave your house. It can all be delivered right to your home. And you can easily subscribe to get reminders and never have to worry about running out. But if you want to keep your hair, prevention is key. The sooner you start, the more hair you'll save. Hair loss stops with Keeps. To get 50% off your first order, go to keeps.com/covert or click the link down in the description. Again, that's keeps.com/covert. First, getting accurate figures is difficult. The federal budget of Russia consists of 14 different line items. These include things like healthcare, social policy, education, law and order, and also defense. The latest year that Russia has released its budget for, 2021, shows just over 3.5 trillion rubles for defense. Now you might notice that different sources have real wide-ranging figures, and it took me a little bit to figure out why. This seems mostly due to what Russia classifies as defense. It doesn't count things like their National Guard, military personnel healthcare and pensions, and then it also includes things that are not typically included in other nations' defense budgets. For example, the decommissioning of armaments. So, suffice it to say, it's not as straightforward as just comparing the numbers to the US and other nations' defense budgets. It's also difficult to compare over time, as the value of the Russian ruble has varied greatly. Therefore, all figures in this video, unless I otherwise note it, will be in Russian rubles. Without taking inflation into account, Russian defense spending has more than doubled in the last 10 years, when it was just over 1.5 trillion in 2011. Another thing you might notice here is a huge decrease from 2016 to 2017. A lot of media outlets at the time attribute it to sanctions, the price of oil dropping, etc. However, most of this drop was due to a loan repayment that they made in 2016 of nearly 800 billion rubles. So, if you subtract this one-time payment, that drop is much less severe. Unfortunately, Russia does not give a more detailed breakdown of their defense spending like the US does. In fact, it's always amazed me just how much detail you can find in US budget documents. It's got every last vehicle being built or upgraded, including the amount procured of every last piece of ammunition it carries, and who and where specifically they're being built. But in Russia, it's all classified. In fact, they don't even publicly release basic details such as how much money is going to each branch, like the Air Force, Ground Force, and Navy. I found that they do often report to the UN on military expenditures, but in recent years they just give a flat figure. The last time they gave a more detailed breakdown was in 2016, and even then it was much less than the standardized form that it's recommended that nations submit. The last full report they gave was in 2013. The breakdowns there vary greatly each year. For example, in 2013 the Air Force received nearly 80%, then in 2016 it only received 14%. A lot of this is due to the massive military modernization project that Russia has been conducting over the last decade. But if you average out the figures, it's more equal. As for procurement, again, the last full reporting was from 2013, so it is old, but a 5-year average has them spending about 21.8% of the budget. And that seems like a reasonable figure considering the US this year spent 19% on procurement. And again, Russia's modernization program means higher than normal procurement costs. So, with a budget of 3.5 trillion, assuming 31.8% for the ground forces and 21.8% of that for procurement, it gives them an estimate of roughly 243 billion rubles. If we look at just tanks, artillery, air defense, and other armored fighting vehicles, in the past that was roughly 25%, so 60.75 billion rubles a year. So what can that buy you? First, tanks. The most notable might be the new T-14 Armata, but right now it's not clear that the tank will ever be mass produced. There's been many conflicting reports on the plans and countless delays, especially now with sanctions making it harder to procure the necessary components. So for now, I'll ignore it. The only tank that Russia is actually producing is the T-90, and that costs somewhere around 200 million rubles each. The T-72B3 is just taking an existing T-72B and upgrading it, and that cost an estimated $90 million. The upgraded T-80s are probably a similar price. Other vehicles, like the BTR-82 upgrades, cost around $30 to $40 million. BMP-3s about $48 million. And the MTLB isn't being produced anymore, but upgraded ones cost somewhere around $20 million. The average self-propelled artillery system costs roughly $300 million, towed about $90, and around $800 million per Panzer and Tor systems, not including the missiles, and $5 billion per Buck battery, again, not counting additional missiles. Now these numbers can all vary depending on source, contract and contract date, additional support equipment, and the value of the ruble, but the numbers are likely close enough to get an idea. According to Oryx, Russia has lost roughly 1,000 tanks, 450 BTRs, 700 BMPs, 300 MTLBs, 155 self-propelled artillery systems, 75 towed artillery, 9 Panzer and 16 Tor, and roughly the equivalent of 3 Buck battalions. The true number is likely somewhat higher, Ukraine claims about twice as many lost, and the real figure is probably somewhere in between those. But just based on the lower Oryx estimate, the cost to replace all of these is roughly 288.6 billion rubles, or 4.81 billion US dollars. And again, keep in mind this is just land vehicles in the ground forces. It's not counting all the missiles used, like Iskander, Caliber, or aircraft lost, etc. If they could double procurement spending per year, it would take 4 years and 9 months to replace all these combat vehicles. The other question is how fast can Russia realistically build this stuff? And could they even double production rates? Since the end of the Cold War, and with reduced demand, most countries have had a hard time keeping certain defense manufacturers in business. Tanks, for example. At the end of the Cold War, the US had 2 tank plants, Detroit and Lima. The lack of demand resulted in the Detroit Arsenal tank production closing down, and recently it was debated closing the Lima tank line as well. At the time, the US already had all the tanks it needed, plus thousands more in reserve, so it was considered pointless to keep building more tanks that the military didn't need. The problem is, once you shut down a line, it would take years and be extremely expensive to ever get it up and running again. For example, the situation Russia is suddenly finding itself in. Russia has been doing things a bit differently to protect against this. Russian military might has always been of extreme importance to the population. A lot of this is likely due to their near defeat by Germany during World War II, and the memory of being a military superpower during the Cold War. Public polls have also shown Russians are increasingly suspicious of the West, especially of the US. Putin's rebuilding and modernizing of both the economy and the military is likely one of the main reasons he therefore has always had such high approval ratings. This being despite his restrictions on individual freedoms, going after political opponents, media censorship, the resulting sanctions, etc. It seems that most Russians are accepting of this in turn for the larger aim of turning back into a major power again and military security. So, with large public support for the military, but a defense budget a fraction of the size of the US, Russia has developed its defense industry complex into a mix of producing both military and civilian goods. The goal is that if the military budgets and procurement decline, these industries can support themselves through manufacturing and selling civilian products. And then, when necessary, it can convert back to military production to meet the demand. In reality though, this has not been extremely successful. There really isn't a huge need for railroad cars, such as the one UVZ produces, to keep the company afloat when orders for tanks decrease. So, the Russian government has had to heavily subsidize these companies with state-guaranteed credits. If you remember earlier in the video, I mentioned a one-time payment of nearly 800 billion rubles that made it look like defense spending had increased. Well, this was actually from them paying these credits that they had given over the years. The industry also suffers from higher levels of corruption, which has created numerous problems over the years and made it less efficient. In the end, the Russian defense industry seems just as fragile as some of those in the US. For example, in 2014, when Iraq canceled its order of self-propelled artillery systems, it put the manufacturer into serious economic difficulties. What was expected to be a huge profit turned into a loss of over 3 billion rubles for the year. That, along with decreasing sales of light rail cars, bankrupted the company. The Russian government had to bail it out, and then it became a subsidiary of UVZ. The other issue is getting the necessary components. Sanctions as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine has made it more difficult for Russia to get things like semiconductors, telecommunications equipment, lasers, and more, all vital to producing modern military hardware. They will likely be able to fix this issue in the long term by sourcing these components from other countries like China. However, it takes a long time to build those relationships and set up supply chains. Along with this is whether Russia has the money to pay for replacement equipment. Sanctions and companies leaving due to the Ukraine war have hurt the Russian economy. Some people will point to the fact that the Russian ruble has made a huge comeback since the war, and therefore think the economy is not just fine, but growing. Well, there's many reasons for the ruble's performance, such as the price of oil, government actions taken, and the decrease in imports. But inflation has become a major problem there. It's nearly twice as high as the US and other European countries like Germany. Also, unemployment is up and the economic forecast is way down. So there's a real question as to whether Russia can afford to rebuild their military anytime soon. Replacing vehicles lost means paying for them on top of continuing to pay for the normal procurement requirements. So this means it'll have to be greatly increased. Like the US, Russia really hasn't been building many new tanks lately. Instead, it's been upgrading and modernizing existing ones, such as the T-72B3 and T-90M at UVZ. However, there's only so many tanks they have in storage that can be upgraded. From my research, Russia has roughly 6,000 tanks in storage. Maybe 2,000 of those are T-72Bs, T-80s, or T-90s in good enough shape that could be modernized. So, replacing 1,000 lost tanks, possibly more, is doable, but it would leave Russia with very little in reserve in the event of another major conflict. UVZ has reportedly upgraded 1,240 T-72Bs into T-72B3s from 2011 to 2021, giving an average of 124 a year. However, in 2014 alone, they reportedly upgraded nearly 300. So if that's any indication of their capabilities, they have the potential to double or even triple output of recent years. Now I won't bore you with each vehicle and production rates, but one other example to look at is the BMP-3. It is built by KMZ, which has also had its own problems. One time it nearly stopped all production over unpaid gas bills. But the rate of BMP-3s produced and/or upgraded has been roughly 100 a year. There hasn't been any noticeable changes or expansions to the plan over the last 10 years, so that could be close to its limit. Working around-the-clock shifts and at a faster pace though may allow them to produce 50% more, maybe even double. The BMP-3s, along with the MTLBs, were supposed to be replaced by the new Kurgans 25. However, like the T-14 Armata, it's been repeatedly delayed, and it might never actually go into full-scale production. In fact, the same is true with the Boomerang BTR replacing the BTR-80s, and the T-15 replacing other IFVs. It's beginning to look less and less likely that these new, expensive vehicles will ever be built. So, in the end, if Russia can't afford to double their procurement spending per year and able to double production rates, in roughly 5 years, they could replace all of the vehicles lost. However, actual numbers of losses are likely somewhat higher, and the war is still ongoing with no signs of ending soon, and they're continuing to lose more combat vehicles every day. Also, again, this is only counting combat vehicles of the ground forces, not missiles or rockets used, or aircraft lost, helicopters, drones, non-combat vehicles, supplies, all the gear and arms for each soldier, medical treatment for injured, payouts to the families of deceased, recruitment drives and training newly enlisted, and much, much more. Some real rough, quick calculations I did comes out to be around 2 trillion rubles just to replace what's been lost or expended in Ukraine. And that's not counting actual operating costs. If spread over 5 years to replace them, it requires an additional 12% increase in the defense spending for each year, which is possible. As mentioned, it seems like the average Russian is willing to undergo some economic setbacks in exchange for increased military might. The real question is what happens to the Russian economy in the next few years. A 12% increase in the budget becomes much more costly if Russia's GDP begins to shrink, and could become a lot worse the longer the war drags on. And finally, an interesting comparison. 2 trillion sounds like a lot, but that's roughly 34 billion US dollars. Calculating the exact military aid to Ukraine is difficult. Some of it is just old stock that doesn't need to be replaced. Others give equipment to Ukraine in exchange for getting equipment from other nations. And then there's also differences in committed amounts versus actual distributed amounts. But the total military aid sent to Ukraine by other countries is likely close to that $34 billion figure. However, these other countries together have a GDP roughly 20 times greater than Russia. So, as long as they can stay united in supporting Ukraine, they can afford it, and they can afford to keep doing it for much longer than Russia.